Hello, beautiful Virgo, and welcome. I'm really glad you're here today. The energy surrounding this reading feels quiet, almost hidden beneath the surface, but there is something incredibly meaningful about it. It feels like someone has reached a place where pretending is no longer working. Whether this message is meant for your situation or simply offers a different perspective, take only what truly resonates with your heart. Okay, let's see where these cards want to lead us. The very first card resting in front of me is the High Priestess. And before I even look at anything else, I can't shake the feeling that silence has been carrying far more truth than words ever could. It almost feels as though someone has been living two completely different realities. One is the version they show the world, calm, composed, perhaps even detached. The other exists deep inside, where your name continues to echo in ways they never expected. Virgo, it seems this person may have spent a long time convincing themselves that these feelings would eventually fade. Maybe they believed enough distance, enough distractions, or simply enough time would erase whatever existed between the two of you. But the High Priestess keeps whispering that some emotions refuse to disappear simply because we stop talking about them. What surprises me is that this no longer feels like a secret they can comfortably carry alone. I wouldn't be surprised if they have recently opened up to someone they deeply trust. Maybe it was a close friend, perhaps a family member, or maybe someone simply asked them a question they weren't prepared to answer honestly until now. Instead of changing the subject, instead of pretending everything was fine, they may have quietly admitted something they have been protecting for far too long. I still think about Virgo. I don't think I've moved on. I still love them. The words may not have sounded exactly like that, but it feels as though the truth finally slipped through the cracks they worked so hard to build. Lying beside it is the Hermit. And honestly, this card changes the atmosphere completely. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels deeply personal. This isn't someone making impulsive decisions. This feels like countless nights spent replaying conversations. Moments where they questioned their own choices. Moments where they wondered whether fear spoke louder than love. Maybe they kept asking themselves if protecting their pride was really worth losing someone who brought genuine peace into their life. Yeah, the Hermit carries the feeling of someone becoming brutally honest with themselves. Not because anyone forced them to, because eventually the silence became impossible to ignore. There is something about Virgo energy that often leaves a lasting impression without trying to. Sometimes you never realize how deeply you've touched another person's life until you've already walked away. And it almost feels like this person is beginning to recognize that now. Then the sun appears, and the entire reading softens. It feels like they're remembering you differently than before. Not through arguments, not through misunderstandings, not through whatever complicated circumstances may have surrounded this connection. Instead, they seem to be remembering how they felt around you, how conversations somehow felt lighter, how your presence made ordinary moments feel meaningful, how simply being near you gave them a sense of calm they couldn't explain at the time. Oh my God! Sometimes people don't fully understand what they have until they're sitting alone trying to recreate a feeling that only existed with one person. It almost feels like they're discovering that happiness isn't always found by searching for something new. Sometimes it's hidden inside a memory they never allowed themselves to appreciate while it was happening. And then there's Nine of Wands. This card doesn't feel like someone giving up. Actually, it feels like quite the opposite. They may look tired. They may still carry old fears. There could still be emotional walls standing between the two of you. But those walls no longer seem designed to keep you out forever. It feels more like someone gathering enough courage to lower them safely. Perhaps they know they made mistakes. Perhaps they regret allowing fear, insecurity, or outside influences to speak louder than their own heart. That realization doesn't erase the past, but it may be changing the direction they're looking toward now. As I sit with these four cards together, something keeps repeating itself in my mind. This doesn't feel like the beginning of love. It feels like the beginning of honesty. Not perfect honesty, not immediate action, Just the quiet moment where someone finally stops arguing with what their own heart has been trying to tell them all along. And Virgo, if this energy belongs to your story, it feels like something hidden beneath the surface has already begun to move, even if very little can be seen from the outside just yet. Sometimes the most meaningful changes happen long before anyone else notices them. Sometimes everything begins with one simple moment, when a person finally admits to themselves what they can no longer deny. The energy shifts the moment Eight of Swords appears, because this doesn't feel like someone who has stopped caring. If anything, it feels like they care so much that every possible conversation keeps playing over and over inside their mind before a single message is ever sent. I almost see them picking up their phone, looking at your name, typing a few words, deleting them, locking the screen, coming back an hour later and doing exactly the same thing. Maybe you've felt that strange pull recently, that sense someone is trying to reach you without actually reaching you. I can't say that's happening for everyone, of course, but it feels like their thoughts are becoming louder than their actions. The strange thing is, it doesn't seem like the biggest obstacle is you. It seems to be themselves. Eight of Swords has this quiet feeling of someone standing in front of an unlocked door while convincing themselves it's still impossible to leave the room. They may be imagining every outcome except the peaceful one. What if Virgo ignores me? What if it's too late? What if I've already ruined everything? Oh my God, our own minds can become convincing storytellers sometimes. They create endings before life even has the chance to write them. This person may be carrying that kind of weight. Not because they know what you'll say, because they don't know. Sometimes uncertainty feels heavier than rejection itself. Resting beside it is King of Pentacles, and I have to smile because this energy feels completely different from panic. Beneath all the hesitation, there seems to be something incredibly steady. It doesn't feel like someone looking for temporary attention. It doesn't feel like someone chasing excitement for a few days before disappearing again. Instead, it feels like someone asking themselves whether they can truly become the kind of person who deserves another opportunity. Yeah, that's a very different question. Perhaps they've realized that saying, "I'm sorry," isn't enough if nothing else changes afterward. Maybe that's why they're taking their time. Not because they don't want to move, because they don't want to arrive empty-handed. I wouldn't be surprised if they've been focusing more on work lately, trying to organize different areas of their life, or quietly rebuilding confidence that once disappeared. It feels less about impressing you and more about feeling capable of standing in front of you without hiding behind excuses anymore. Virgo, there is something beautifully practical about this energy. It feels like someone who wants their actions to speak before their promises do. That doesn't mean they're perfectly ready, far from it, but their heart may already be moving in a direction their feet are still trying to catch up with. Page of Wands suddenly brings a lighter feeling into the reading, almost playful, almost hopeful. This card makes me wonder whether communication begins much smaller than either of you expect. Maybe it isn't a dramatic confession. Maybe it starts with something surprisingly simple. A message asking how you've been, a funny memory, a reaction to something you shared, a conversation that appears ordinary on the surface while carrying far more emotion underneath. Sometimes people test the emotional temperature before stepping completely back into someone's world. It feels like this person may be wondering whether there is still room for laughter between the two of you, whether kindness still exists, whether the door is completely closed, or simply waiting for someone brave enough to knock. Courage doesn't always arrive as a grand gesture. Sometimes courage is just sending the very first sentence, the one that's been rewritten 100 different ways. Beside that sits Six of Wands, and what catches my attention isn't pride, it's relief. It almost feels like this person keeps imagining what it would feel like if the conversation actually went better than expected. If they could finally stop carrying this invisible weight, if they could see even the smallest sign that healing might still be possible. Perhaps they're hoping for victory, not over you, but over the fear that's been holding them back. That's a battle very few people ever talk about. The quiet battle between wanting to reach out and wondering whether you still deserve to. I also wouldn't be surprised if they're paying closer attention to you than you realize. Not in a controlling way, more like someone searching for little clues, trying to understand how you're doing, trying to figure out whether life has been kind to you, wondering if you've found happiness, wondering if there's still a place where they belong inside your story. Virgo, if these cards are reflecting your connection, it seems this person is measuring every step with incredible care. They don't appear eager to rush toward the finish line. Instead, they seem to be hoping that if they do speak, the words will finally carry the honesty they've struggled to express for far too long. Death is the first card to settle into this part of the reading, and before anything else comes through, I get the feeling that something inside this person has already started ending long before anyone around them noticed. It doesn't feel like they're trying to erase the past. If anything, it feels like they're finally allowing themselves to stop defending it. That's not always an easy place to reach. Sometimes people spend months convincing themselves they did the right thing simply because admitting otherwise feels too painful. But eventually, life has a quiet way of placing us in moments where our own heart asks questions we can no longer avoid. Perhaps that's what's happening here. It feels like this person has been replaying certain memories from a completely different perspective. Conversations they once believed were insignificant suddenly carry new meaning. Moments where they chose silence instead of vulnerability may now look very different through older, wiser eyes. I wouldn't be surprised if they've caught themselves thinking, "Why didn't I just say what I felt?" Or, "Why was I so afraid of simply being honest?" Oh my God. Sometimes growth begins with questions that don't have comfortable answers. The energy surrounding death feels less like loss and more like surrender. Surrendering old habits, old defenses, old versions of themselves that believed protecting their ego mattered more than protecting a meaningful connection. Virgo, there seems to be a quiet realization taking place. They may be recognizing that some of the distance between you wasn't created by a lack of love. It may have grown from fear, misunderstanding, pride, or simply not knowing how to express emotions in a healthy way. Those realizations don't rewrite history, but they may be reshaping the future they're hoping to build. Beside it rests justice, and this card immediately brings a different feeling into the room. Not punishment, balance. It almost feels like this person has reached a point where excuses no longer bring comfort. Instead of asking who was right, they seem to be asking what was fair, what was honest, what could have been handled differently. Yeah, those are much quieter questions, but they often lead to deeper change. It feels as though they're beginning to understand that healing isn't about proving themselves innocent. Perhaps it's about taking responsibility without expecting instant forgiveness. That energy feels surprisingly mature. I wouldn't be surprised if they've imagined apologizing more than once. Not because they believe an apology magically fixes everything, because some words deserve to be spoken regardless of the outcome. "I'm sorry. I should have listened. I understand why you felt hurt." Those sentences carry a very different weight when they've been shaped by genuine reflection instead of desperation. Ace of Swords appears almost like fresh air entering a room that has been closed for far too long. The atmosphere becomes lighter, clearer. It feels like someone growing tired of hiding behind uncertainty. Maybe they've realized that assumptions create far more distance than honest conversations ever could. Perhaps they're beginning to understand that clarity is an act of respect. Even difficult truths can become gifts when they're offered with sincerity. There is something beautiful about that. Instead of rehearsing perfect words, they may simply be hoping to speak from a place that feels real, not polished, not rehearsed, just honest. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, that honesty also seems directed inward. They're no longer pretending certain emotions don't exist simply because acknowledging them feels uncomfortable. Sometimes the hardest truth to speak is the one we first have to admit to ourselves. The final card here is Eight of Pentacles, and I honestly love seeing it after everything else because it doesn't promise instant transformation. It speaks of consistency, small choices repeated over time, quiet effort that nobody applauds. This person may be discovering that becoming someone different isn't about making one dramatic gesture. It's about changing the little things, learning healthier ways to communicate, being more patient, listening before reacting, showing care through actions instead of assuming feelings are already understood. Virgo, it almost feels like they're rebuilding themselves one brick at a time. Not because someone demanded it, because they're starting to see that the version of themselves they want to become requires that kind of dedication. Maybe there are still moments when old fears return. Maybe they still question whether they're ready. Growth rarely moves in a perfectly straight line. But it does seem like they're choosing progress over comfort. And sometimes that's the quietest kind of courage, the kind nobody celebrates while it's happening, the kind that slowly changes the way a person speaks, the way they love, and eventually, the way they show up when another chance finds its way to their door. Four of Wands settles onto the table with an energy that feels surprisingly peaceful. It doesn't feel rushed, it doesn't feel dramatic. Instead, it feels like someone who has quietly stopped chasing temporary emotions and started asking themselves what kind of future they truly want to wake up to every morning. Virgo, I keep getting the feeling that this person isn't daydreaming about one perfect conversation anymore. Their mind seems to wander much further than that. Perhaps they're imagining ordinary moments, cooking dinner together, laughing over something completely unimportant, walking through a grocery store on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on the couch after a long day without needing to fill every silence with words. Yeah, it's almost beautiful how simple these visions feel. Sometimes people think love is built from extraordinary moments, but it seems this person may finally be realizing that real happiness often hides inside the ordinary, inside consistency, inside showing up, inside knowing someone chooses you again tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if they've started looking at commitment differently than they once did. Maybe there was a time when stability felt restrictive. Maybe responsibility seemed intimidating. But something appears to have shifted. The life they once thought they wanted doesn't seem as meaningful without someone to share it with. That's a very quiet awakening. No grand announcement. Just a heart slowly changing its priorities. Lying beside it is Two of Wands, and I can't ignore how thoughtful this energy feels. This isn't someone acting on impulse. They're measuring possibilities, considering consequences, trying to understand not only what they feel, but how they can move toward those feelings with wisdom instead of fear. It almost feels like they're standing at the edge of a bridge they've been afraid to cross for a long time. The bridge hasn't changed. What's changing is the person standing in front of it. Perhaps they're asking themselves difficult questions. If Virgo gives me another chance, what kind of partner do I want to become? What would I need to do differently this time? What habits should I leave behind before I walk back into their life? Oh my God, those questions don't usually come from someone looking for another temporary chapter. They sound more like someone hoping the next chapter lasts. There's also a quiet sense of preparation here. Maybe they're organizing practical parts of their life, making room emotionally, learning to balance responsibilities that once overwhelmed them. It doesn't feel like they're trying to become perfect. It feels like they're trying to become dependable. For Virgo, that kind of energy carries its own language. Promises become more meaningful when they're supported by consistent actions. The next card, Wheel of Fortune, brings a gentle reminder that life rarely stays exactly the same forever. Seasons change, people change, perspectives change. Sometimes the version of ourselves that made old decisions no longer exists by the time we finally understand them. Perhaps this person has started noticing little moments that feel strangely meaningful, a familiar song, a place that reminds them of you, a conversation that unexpectedly brings your name back into their thoughts. I'm not saying every coincidence carries a hidden message, but it feels like these experiences have encouraged them to pause, instead of dismissing everything as random. They may be wondering whether life has been quietly guiding them toward lessons they weren't ready to understand before. Virgo, it also feels like they're becoming more patient with timing, not because they want to delay happiness, because they're beginning to respect that some things cannot be forced. Some conversations arrive naturally. Some healing takes longer than expected. Some opportunities appear only after both people have grown enough to recognize them. There is something unexpectedly peaceful about accepting that. The final card here is King of Wands, and honestly, I love where this energy lands. Earlier, there was hesitation, reflection, questions. This feels different, not louder, stronger. It carries the feeling of someone who wants to stop hiding behind uncertainty and begin living according to what truly matters to them. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll rush toward you tomorrow. It simply feels like their confidence is no longer being built on pride, it's being built on honesty. Perhaps they're discovering that courage isn't about pretending to have no fears. It's about moving with those fears instead of letting them make every decision. Yeah, there's a big difference. I also wouldn't be surprised if they want you to see a different version of them whenever your paths cross again. Not someone trying to impress you with big speeches. Not someone asking you to ignore the past. Someone hoping you'll notice the quiet changes, the patience, the consistency, the willingness to listen. Because sometimes the most convincing apology isn't spoken all at once. Sometimes it's revealed little by little through the way a person chooses to love when they've finally learned what love truly asks of them. Knight of Swords arrives with an energy that feels impossible to ignore. After so much reflection, so many quiet moments, and all the careful planning, something seems to be building momentum inside this person. It doesn't necessarily feel impulsive. It feels more like someone who has finally grown tired of carrying words that were never spoken. I keep seeing this image of someone rehearsing a conversation while driving, walking alone, or lying awake long after everyone else has fallen asleep. Not because they enjoy living inside their own thoughts, because there's a part of them that keeps asking, if I don't say it soon, will I regret staying silent for the rest of my life? That question has a different kind of weight. It doesn't create panic, it creates urgency. Perhaps they're beginning to realize that waiting forever doesn't protect the heart. Sometimes it only allows more distance to grow between two people who still care. Virgo, if this energy belongs to your story, it feels like they want to stop imagining conversations and actually have one. Not to convince you, not to pressure you, simply to let the truth exist outside of their own mind for once. The next card, Page of Pentacles, softens everything immediately. Instead of dramatic declarations, I get the feeling that whatever communication comes may begin with something surprisingly gentle. Maybe a simple greeting, a thoughtful question, a message that seems ordinary at first glance, but carries months of reflection beneath a few carefully chosen words. Yeah, sometimes the smallest messages require the greatest courage, especially when someone has no way of knowing how they'll be received. I wouldn't be surprised if this person has rewritten that first message countless times, removing sentences, adding others, wondering if they're saying too much, then worrying they're saying too little. It almost feels like they're searching for words that are honest, without becoming overwhelming. Words that leave space for your feelings, instead of expecting immediate answers. That feels important, because genuine change often learns to listen before asking to be heard. There's also a quiet humility surrounding this card. This person doesn't appear interested in making impossible promises anymore. Perhaps they've realized that trust isn't rebuilt through beautiful speeches. It's rebuilt one honest moment at a time. One consistent action. One respectful conversation. One opportunity to show that growth wasn't temporary. When Ace of Cups appears, the atmosphere changes once again. The energy becomes warmer, softer, almost vulnerable. It feels like emotions that have been carefully contained are beginning to rise to the surface. Not in a way that demands attention, more in the way a river eventually finds its own path after meeting too many obstacles. I keep hearing a sentence that may never have been spoken out loud. I never stopped caring. Maybe those exact words won't be used. Maybe they'll sound completely different. But the feeling behind them seems remarkably similar. There also appears to be a desire to create something healthier than what existed before. Not returning simply because the connection is familiar, returning because both hearts may understand things differently than they once did. Oh my God, that's a very different reason to begin again. Love often becomes quieter as it matures, less interested in proving itself, more interested in protecting what truly matters. This card carries that feeling beautifully. Finally, the moon settles into place, reminding me that not every emotion has already found its voice. There are still fears living beneath the surface, still uncertainties, still questions that may not have immediate answers. Perhaps this person worries you'll doubt their sincerity. Perhaps they wonder whether too much time has already passed. Maybe they even fear that you've already found a happiness they no longer have the right to interrupt. Those thoughts don't necessarily disappear overnight, but they no longer seem strong enough to erase the desire for honesty. Virgo, I also feel that this conversation, whenever it unfolds in whatever way life chooses, may carry more emotion than either of you initially expect. Not because anyone plans for tears, not because anyone intends to revisit old pain, simply because truth has a way of touching places that silence never could. Sometimes people spend months trying to protect themselves from vulnerability, only to discover that the greatest sense of peace arrives the moment they stop pretending they're unaffected. It feels like this person is moving closer to that realization. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, just sincerely. And perhaps sincerity is exactly what they've been searching for all along. The Lovers is the first card waiting here, and it carries such a quiet sense of intention. It doesn't feel like fantasy anymore. It doesn't feel like someone getting caught up in a fleeting emotion that disappears with time. Instead, it feels like a heart that has slowly learned the difference between wanting someone's attention and wanting to become a safe place for them. Virgo, I keep feeling that this person no longer wants to measure love by grand declarations alone. Perhaps they've begun asking themselves a different question. How do I make someone feel secure enough to believe me again? That question changes everything, because trust isn't something that appears overnight. It grows through consistency, through patience, through showing up when it's easier to disappear. There is something incredibly gentle about that realization. It feels like they're beginning to understand that real love isn't proven during perfect moments. It's revealed in ordinary days, in keeping promises, in listening carefully, in choosing honesty even when honesty feels uncomfortable. I wouldn't be surprised if they're becoming much more aware of how every small action leaves an impression. A thoughtful message, remembering something important to you, following through instead of making another promise they'll struggle to keep. Those little things seem far more meaningful to them now than dramatic gestures ever could. The next card, the Tower, might surprise some people, but honestly, it doesn't feel frightening in this reading. It feels liberating, almost like someone watching an old version of themselves quietly fall away. Perhaps there were beliefs they've carried for years, beliefs that vulnerability is weakness, that asking for forgiveness means losing control, that emotions should always remain hidden behind strength. One by one, those old ideas seem to be losing their power. Oh my God! Growth sometimes feels uncomfortable precisely because it asks us to leave behind the identities we've become familiar with. This person may not recognize themselves completely anymore, not because they've become someone else, because they're allowing parts of themselves to exist that were once locked away. It almost feels like they've stopped trying to win every internal argument. Instead, they're learning to choose peace. Perhaps that's the greatest transformation of all. Not changing for someone else's approval. Changing because life has quietly shown them a softer way to exist. There is also a sense that they don't want history to repeat itself. Whatever once created distance seems to have become one of their greatest teachers. Maybe they can't erase those experiences. But they may be determined not to build the future using the same habits that created the past. That intention feels genuine. The appearance of Ten of Cups brings such warmth into the reading that I can't help smiling. This doesn't necessarily feel like someone chasing an impossible fairy tale. It feels much more grounded than that. They're imagining peace, mutual understanding, a relationship where both people feel accepted without constantly wondering where they stand. Perhaps they've realized that happiness isn't found by finding someone perfect. Maybe it's found by becoming more honest, more present, and more willing to grow alongside another person. Virgo, I also get the feeling that this person isn't only thinking about what they hope to receive, they're beginning to think about what they hope to give. Support, stability, kindness, emotional safety. Yeah, love becomes incredibly beautiful when generosity quietly replaces fear. Whether this connection unfolds exactly that way isn't something any reading can promise. Every heart has its own timing. Every journey has its own lessons. But the desire to build something healthier seems very real within this energy. The final card is the World, and it feels less like an ending than a gentle sense of completion, almost as though certain chapters have already served their purpose. Old misunderstandings, old fears, old versions of both people. Life has a remarkable way of using those experiences to prepare us for perspectives we couldn't have understood before. Sometimes we spend months believing we're losing something important, only to discover later that we were quietly becoming someone capable of loving in a completely different way. Virgo, perhaps that's the message these cards have been trying to share from the very beginning. Not that every story always ends the way we imagine. Not that every apology automatically restores what was broken, but that sincere growth has a way of changing the direction of a heart. And when a heart changes, the choices that follow often begin to change as well. If this reading has found you at the right moment, maybe let it be less about predicting tomorrow and more about noticing what feels true within your own spirit today. Sometimes healing begins with another person's courage. Sometimes it begins with our own. And sometimes, without either of us realizing it at first, two people spend so much time searching for the right path that they eventually discover they were both quietly learning how to walk toward a healthier future, one honest step at a time. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, Virgo. I truly appreciate you being here. Take what resonates, leave behind what doesn't, and trust your own intuition above everything else. You are so important to me, and I'll see you again in the next reading. Until then, take good care of yourself. Bye for now.